Hey everyone, I've got a couple of cool synths on the bench today that need some attention and fixing. So I've got the Roland Alpha Juno 1 and I've got the Roland Alpha Juno 2. So both of these synths are important for a couple of reasons. Number one, they were essentially the last actual analog synth in the Juno series that Roland had made before they took a couple different turns and started, building some other synths there. So in the Juno range, obviously you had the Juno 6, 6106. This came after that. And because of that, it still uses some of the analog components that you found in those other, famous Roland Juno synths, specifically like the chorus. And even though the filters weren't the exact same ICs they used in these, they were very similar. Number two, when these came out, the Juno 1 was released in 1985. The Juno 2 follows shortly after that. The primary competitor essentially was the Yamaha DX7, which had come out just a couple years earlier. And the DX7 was basically just stealing the market. One of the things I had to change to make these cost competitive with them, which is what they were, the Juno 1 listed for, I think, was just under $1,000, which was basically almost the exact list price that the DX7 had at the time. And what they were trying to do is just be cost competitive with, the Yamaha in terms of that range. And if you notice, it's kind of similar to the DX7 in terms of, gone is the control surface with all your knobs and sliders. It went to just a simple, surface on the front here where you got your digital selection and stuff like that. And they introduced their alpha dial, which was basically just a digital encoder that allowed you to select your parameters on the actual display. So all that was just cost savings. It's much cheaper to build a synth this way, without all your potentiometers and other data input you need on there. Number two, with the storing of presets and everything on there, with the microcontroller that runs everything, it just makes it easier and cheaper to make. So all that said, even though control surface is gone, this is kind of a synth that a lot of people don't look at very closely in that regard, which you should actually do it because it is still a very good sounding synth. It's not unbelievably capable. It only has a single oscillator with a sub oscillator, and you can do some other fancy things with it too, get the sound out of it. So it is still a powerful synth, just not as powerful as some of the analog predecessors I had before it. Specifically like your Jupiters and things like this, where you had multiple oscillators, for each voice. So both these synths are obviously, as I mentioned, very similar. The Alpha Juno 1 is known as the JU1, and then there's the JU2 for the Alpha Juno 2. There was a rack unit called the MKS50, which was basically just the same synth inside it. There's also this weird Synth Plus series that Roland had released. It was more designed for the home consumer market. The HS10 was basically the Alpha Juno 1. It is identical, it just has different letters on it in terms of labeling and stuff like that. But it is the exact same synth. So differences between the two, there's the obvious differences. Juno 1's 49 key, Juno 2 61 key. Juno 2 is also velocity and aftertouch sensitive. The Alpha Juno 1 is not. There's pros and cons to both of that. Usually the Juno 1 keypad's a little bit more reliable because it's not as complex. Besides that, the only really differences are the Juno 1 is a plastic case and the Juno 2 is metal. So it's a little bit more durable than the Juno 1, which is actually one of the problems I had with this, is this unit's been dropped. So it's got some cracking on the back there, which I'll discuss in the video, and I'll do my best to repair that. This just sits in my studio, so it never moves, so it's not a big deal to me. Juno 2, like I mentioned, is a little bit more rugged, but even with that, I mean, it flexes still quite a bit. You can probably see the movement in there when you kind of put some torque on the corners there with not very much effort. So they're not super durable synths in terms of if either one of these were to be dropped, it's pretty much done. So luckily this one isn't more broken than it currently is. Other than that, they both have 6 voices of polyphony, and there was a programmer available for them, which I actually have one. It's the Roland PG300. So this allowed you to basically have the additional control surfaces, for programming this. So programming this isn't bad. Once you get used to it and you get it memorized, you can get really fast at it, which I was. I finally found a PG300 for a reasonable price, so I bought one, and it does make everything just great compared to doing without. These PG300s will cost you more than either of these combined, basically, or each of these individually in a great working state. The Juno 1s you can usually find, especially if they're not working or not that great condition, is a little $100. Juno 2 is usually a little bit more, but typically you can find both of these for under $300, which is nice. And that's usually right around where the price of the PG300 starts. There was also a couple manufacturers that produced aftermarket PG300s. They're 100% compatible with the Alpha Junos in terms of programming, but they cost just as much as buying one of these used. I mean, they'll still set you back over $300, $400 for some of them. So I do recommend the programmer, but it's not necessary. You can still get a lot of usability out of the synth just by programming it with the alpha dial and just going through a couple of the options or the parameters on there. So in this video, we'll be taking a look at the Junos, taking them apart. I'll be going through, I'll probably split it into 2 videos actually, and to keep the time down between the two. So the Alpha Juno 1 I'll probably do in this video. So I'll take it apart, clean it. Both of these need to be cleaned very thoroughly. I'm going to look at the power supply. So in terms of overall reliability and problems you have with these, they're actually pretty reliable. You don't see too many problems. The buttons can go bad, but they're easy to replace. It's not a big deal there. The LCD, it's just a single line by 16 character HT 44780 display, so you can replace that fairly easily if you need to, or replace the backlight if the backlight goes dim. The battery in these is soldered in, but it's not hard to replace. A lot of times too, by now, I mean, these are approaching, what, 35 years old. The batteries typically have been replaced at some point already, so you may be fine with the battery in there if it's still working for you. So the alpha dial, the encoder on the alpha dial can go bad, but that usually can be cleaned and you can replace it if necessary. There were some ROM upgrades on these too, so as we go through this, we'll take a look at the firmware version, see what's on there, and upgrade that if necessary. Just some features, bug fixes, things like that. So that's kind of it for an overview. In this video, I'll probably be going through one of these. I'll probably do the Juno one first. I'll take it apart, look at some of the areas I mentioned. We'll look at the power supply. We'll take a look at the circuitry, see what chips are in there to make it work, and then clean it too. Both these need to be cleaned very, very well. So that is the plan. So looking at the Alpha Juno 1 first, we'll take a look at the back here. And this back corner is where it took a hit. So you can see it's cracked right there. And along the whole back, because this whole top is plastic, all the screws that hold every portion of the top in there is cracked as well, which is unfortunate. So you can't just glue this back together, it'll never last. As soon as you put the screws in, it'll crack again. So I'm going to see if I can do some backing plate, just a thin piece of plastic or metal on there to give it some strength, epoxy it back together, and see what I can do there. Actually, this piece just fell off too, sitting over here. So we'll do our best to get that back together and bend the metal back a little bit there too. But just taking a look at the back quick too, it's got the lovely Roland 2-pin power cable, which I hate. So you can replace that with a standard IEC, 3-pin if you want. I'm not going to do in this video, but it is an option. Typical MIDI in out through, memory protect switch, tape, safe and load if you want to save the tape, pedals, outputs, and then your headphones and stereo left right out there as well. So, I mean, I should also mention the bottom on this is metal. The top is plastic, but the bottom is metal. And then the Alpha Juno 2, the entire case is metal. So you have a little bit better strength with that one there, even though it's not, like I mentioned, not super rugged. So we'll start taking this apart. So here's inside the Alpha Juno. We will move the camera over to get a better look. Alright, so here's inside the JU1, Roland Alpha Juno 1. So just kind of starting from the back side here, off camera a little bit, you've got the input filtering or input protection. There's fusing them off basically. And it goes through your transformer, then you got a small linear supply, which that'll provide your voltages to your main board here, which is essentially the only board in the unit. So this side you got your digital section, obviously runs the synth, runs the actual display, the front panel, does all the matrix encoding for the keys. There's your battery, it's just a standard 3-volt lithium. We'll check that in a little bit. Then you get into your sound generation. You got your DAC in here somewhere for your oscillators. I forgot to mention, this does have digital oscillators, like a lot of the later synths did. They weren't running analog oscillators at this point, so you gain the stability of those digital oscillators, which is nice. So then going through here, you can kind of see the voicing section. So as we cross this way across, or as we move this way across the board, you got 6 of these chips here, which are your IR 3R05s. These are your analog filters. These are actually the same chips that are used in the Roland JX line. So the JX3P and the JX8P use these same analog filters. Cutoff on them, I believe, I'm not sure if it's 12 decibels or 24 decibels per I gotta check the specs on them. We'll pull up the data sheet here in a little bit, but very classic chip. And then moving through the circuit further, you've got op amps that run a lot of your analog output driving, and your chorus chip is going to be in here somewhere as well. Besides that, only other boards, you've got some jack boards in the back for your MIDI and your flip switches and your audio output. You got a little board over here for controls, along with the top panel control board that sits down below there. And then you've got your rotary encoder for the alpha dial sitting over there. On this synth, if you had to remove the key bed to deal with any keys on it, you would basically just have to unplug some of these cables here, unscrew this main board. This board will flip up out of the way, and then you can get to all the screws on the key bed itself, which will lift up and allow you to work on it. The rubber membrane pads for the actual keys are on the bottom side of this underneath the keys, so you have to start removing the keys to get to them, like on most Roland synths, at least in this era. Alright, so while we're in here, let's just check this battery really quick, just see how it is. .3, so it's still good. I can't actually tell if that's been replaced or not. I gotta get a closer look in there. It may have already been replaced, but we'll see. Here's a closer look at the main board. There's a couple more little details I wanted to talk about before we move on in this video. So first, the main board is actually labeled Roland JU1 main board. So between the Alpha Juno 1 and the Alpha Juno 2, they actually use two completely different boards, even though they're essentially the same synth, minus the minor differences we talked about. But you would think that it would be the same board between the two, and they just have some additional circuitry for the key bed to deal with velocity after touch and stuff like that, but they're not. It's completely redesigned. The filtering section, everything over here is different between the two, and I'll do a screenshot of the two to compare to actually show the differences between them, but they are very different, which is interesting. Next thing I wanted to talk about was actually the ROM on here. So here's the Eeprom that actually contains the firmware for the device, and two things to note with this. Number one, you'll see it's actually labeled JU1, version 2.6 here on the actual little sticker on the Eeprom window, which is the latest version of firmware that was made for this unit. There were many revisions before that, but this is the latest. The second thing to note here is this Eeprom is actually soldered to the board. Most aren't like this. Typically this chip is socketed. My guess, based on looking at date codes here, which is, let's see, 43rd week 85, 39th week 85, 85, 85, 86, 9th week 86 here, 85. So early 86, mid 86, somewhere in there is probably when this was made, which is actually a little bit later during the actual evolution of the synth. They probably decided, hey, this is the last version, we're just going to solder it in, and that was that. But if you did need to upgrade the firmware in your version, this is where that chip would go. We'll see when we open the Alpha Juno 2 if it's different there. The next chip over here, this device here, which is the Roland RD87123. I misspoke earlier in the video when I said we would look at the digital analog converter. This doesn't have one, being actually a digital oscillator based synth, and that's what this chip is. It's actually the sound generator for the Alpha Junos. So this generates, basically it's your digital oscillator for all 6 voices in the synth. It produces all of the waveforms in the synth as well, your sawtooths, your square waves, your pulse waves. It's all synced to the master clock, which is over here at 12 megahertz crystal. So this is actually divided down through some of the logic that drives that, and your actual waveforms are come from that master clock there. Due to the way that it operates, you can't really detune any of the oscillators in this like you could, more traditional synths. But that was just a design choice that Roland made for these designs. Next, looking at this section here, it's the IR3R05, which we talked about before. Those are your analog filters, one for each voice, the same analog filters that are used in the JX series of synths. These are 24 decibels per octave low-pass filters, and then they also handle the high-pass filtering as well. Finally, last chip and note is the MN3009. There's actually 2 of them in here. This is your bucket brigade chip, which is it's basically an analog delay that is your chorus. And there's 2 of them on here. One for each audio channel, I believe, but I'd have to look at the schematic to be sure. Either way, famous chip. These were in, like I said, the Juno 6 6106, so they've been around quite a while and are the source of the noisy chorus that the Roland synths have always been known for. Power supply section, nothing special. So you've got your input filtering here, not even input filtering, you've got a fuse and a MOV, input protection I should say. Goes to your transformer, and the secondary out of the transformer goes over to the power supply, where it's just traditional Roland supply. You've got a couple of positive, negative 15 volt regulators there for the analog stuff. You've got a 5 volt, section here regulator for the plus 5 volt. And then the only difference on this between most synth I've seen at Roland synths is that you've got this section here. This is actually high frequency, high voltage supply that actually drives the LCD backlight, the yellow backlight for the LCD. So that comes right out of that section there. Typically, Roland gear doesn't get very hot. Even on these older synths, the power supplies usually are not problematic. On this synth, I might go ahead and just replace these capacitors because I'm in here, and I plan on keeping this for quite some time. So typically, you wouldn't need to do this. We'll have a look at these once I pull them off and see if they're leaking, but I usually don't see any problems on the Alpha Junos in terms of power supplies. I mean, maybe there's potentially some cases where they've been on a lot of hours on them and actually heated up over time, but the capacitors they use are pretty good quality. In this case, they're Sanyos, so slight derivation from typically you'd see, your Nippon Chemicon, your Nishikons in there from Roland. Only 85C rated as well, not 105. So if I do replace these, I'll put 105 C rated caps in there. There's not a ton. You've got 5 little ones here in the output, then your 3 main ones. A 3300 at microfarad at 25 volt, 2 1000s at 35, and then I'll have to look at the smaller values there. So I replaced them anyway. I know I didn't need to. I took them out. I actually checked the caps too. They weren't leaking. They seemed fine. But I'm in here. It's only $10 or less worth of caps. That's small quantities too. Cheaper if you buy them in bulk. So I used Panasonic EEU series capacitors, 105C rated. Pretty long endurance. I don't remember specifically 5 or 10,000 hours, but really quality caps. I mean, the Sanyos that were in here, I mean, they did their job. They weren't leaking. Based on the life they've had, so they were fine. And, reasonably good quality cap for the purpose. But anyway, that is done. The last thing I need to address on this is the broken plastic, like I mentioned. So there isn't really a great solution for this. I mean, there's some epoxies you can use, like if I had the pieces that were broken off to glue back in. Problem with that is it's not going to last. As soon as you tighten these back down, it's going to crack. It just will. There are some really good epoxies out there for plastics that are stronger, but you still need to be careful with it. It'll never be as strong as the original mold when this is made. The corner piece that's broken, I'll glue that back in because I have that, and that's more of a cosmetic piece anyway. But for this, it's more of just holding it together. So I've got some thin plastic that I think I'm going to use. I'll cut an epoxy to the back here. And then once it's dried and I put it back together, I can put a hole in it, and actually that'll line up to the hole there where I put the screws in. And all that will do is just hold it together so it doesn't fall apart. If I pick it up, it's not going to try to separate off the back. You do have these 2 structural pieces here tying the back plate down to the front, so I mean it's not going to fall apart, but you saw how flimsy these are. I just want to try to make it as rigid as possible. And again, regarding the replacement capacitors, you don't need to do this at this time. I'm strictly doing this because, well, I'm anal about my gear, and I want to make sure everything's good. That way 10, maybe another 15 years down the road, if I still have this, I don't need to worry about the power supply. Last steps is really just a good clean. This thing's pretty dirty, so I need to really go through all the keys as well. The keys are pretty nasty. Always make sure you don't use paper towel on the display particularly, because that will scratch the display. Always use a nice microfiber, type cloth. With a good plastic cleaner. Don't use anything with ammonia, bleach, anything like that, because that will also damage plastic. So it cleaned up reasonably well. There's still a little bit of wear on the keys, but it's not too bad. I'm not sure if it's showing up on camera there or not, but so it looks good. I'm happy with it. Just power it up, make sure it still works, which it does. So the backlight on this too, it's just bright enough where it's there and I can see it in a dimly lit room, so it's fine for me now. I probably should replace it, but I'm not going to, because I've got a bunch of repairs coming up here that I am going to replace in the EL backlights in these displays, so I'm saving that content for those. This video is going to go along anyway with both synths here. So here's how I'm going to address the broken plastic problem on the back. So you can't really see it too well on camera here, but these are where the screw holes are busted out on the plastic case. So I need a backer plate to give it some strength. And I've got this plastic. This is low density polyethylene. I'm not even sure where I received this from, but it was a nice piece of it, and I kept it because of that reason, really. So I've been cutting it into strips, just small pieces, and then the plan is I'm going to epoxy it to the back here, just below to the back where it's flush here. And that will allow me to have something for the screw to bite into. So I'm going to be using this plastic epoxy. I've used this stuff before. I know it's good for plastics that's what it's designed for, and I know it doesn't melt plastic, so I like it. I use it for a lot of different things. Any epoxy will do as long as it's plastic safe. So that is the plan. I will glue these along here, and then I will, once it dries, I'll be able to put this back together. I'll drill small holes in the plastic to line up to the screw holes there, and then screw it back together. And again, all this is going to do is just give it strength so that it won't fall apart, essentially. So I got it all back together. The backing plastic in there, I drilled holes as you saw and put the screws in. And I mean, it's holding it together. So this should work just fine. You can barely see the plastic, if at all anyway. The only signs of it actually being broken is the fact the little pieces of plastic here are missing along the bottom, but just very small cosmetic things. In terms of just the structural, structure of it, it's much stronger. It already feels much stronger now. I'm picking up just on the plastic right now, and it's not separating. So I feel I am good with this. So this concludes the repair of the Alpha Juno 1. Wasn't too much of a repair here. Like I said, it was working when I got it, so it was mostly cosmetic. But the Alpha Juno 2, which I showed earlier in the video, I've actually been working on that for a little bit here. I've got it on the bench right now, and that one has a little bit more in-depth repair than the Alpha Juno 1 does. So that video will follow this one. I thought about making them both into one, but I don't. The hour-long, hour-and-a-half-long videos just are too much. So it's better just to break this up into each part for the Alpha Juno 1 and the Alpha Juno 2. So that will follow this. I hope this was interesting and beneficial to you, and thank you for watching.